Hi, these are the most fascinating historical photos I've been able to find. Let's go. 69 boys were locked inside this dorm in Arkansas in 1959 when a fire started before dawn. 21 died, 48 got out, and no one was ever charged. Eusebio Linatok survived the 1945 Pamintahan massacre in Batangas after Japanese troops marched hundreds of men from nearby villages to a killing site near Lipa. A wound across his throat changed his voice for life. Wreckage from Aeroflot Flight 909 marks the crash that became the deadliest air disaster in Russia in 1976. An electrical failure brought the plane down, killing 111 people on board and 7 more on the ground. Prisoners in Rangoon jail were forced to walk this giant treadmill in the late 1890s as part of daily punishment and labor. In colonial Burma, human bodies were used like engines to keep the prison running. A United States reconnaissance plane captured this Japanese seaplane base at Kavieng Harbor on February 15, 1944. The float planes lined along the shore were Mitsubishi F-1 M2 Scouts, known to Allied crews by the simple code name Pete. The Iceman carried massive blocks by hand, and his strength made him a minor sensation in the late 19th century. Some husbands even grew jealous of the man who came only to deliver ice. Marilyn Monroe poses for Jean Trindle on June 27, 1957. Even her promo shots looked like headline material. Navy gunners stand by a ship weapon with cloth masks over their faces, ready for the next shot. The photo captures how brutal smoke and blast could be, even for the crew behind the gun. A United States Spitfire sits wrecked at Paestum, Italy, after American anti-aircraft fire hit it by mistake in October 1943. The pilot survived without injury. An American infantryman sits on an unexploded 16-inch battleship shell on Saipan in 1944 while checking his shoe. Shells this large came from United States battleships offshore, and one dud could weigh more than a small car. German prisoners captured by the 4th Canadian Division sit near Inchy after the Canal du Nord assault on September 27, 1918. Breaking that canal line helped open the road to Cambrai in the final weeks of the war. Abu Dhabi was still a small coastal settlement in 1954, years before the United Arab Emirates was created. Oil exports would begin in the 1960s and change this shoreline beyond recognition. Steve Wozniak built the Apple I in 1976 as a bareboard computer for hobbyists, not as a finished home machine. Fewer than 200 were made, and surviving originals later became some of the most valuable early computers ever sold. Hitler shows Mussolini the blasted room after the July 20th plot in 1944. He survived with minor injuries, and the failed attack led to a huge purge across Germany. A South African Ratel crew sights a burned-out Angolan T-54 during Operation Modular in 1987. In this bush war, armor often fought at less than 100 meters, sometimes as close as 50. A man on stilts advertises laundry soap in Poznan in 1932, turning a street ad into a live spectacle. The scene played out in front of the former imperial castle, a symbol of German rule that Poland had taken over after the First World War. A rope team climbs the Bianco Ridge in Grisons in 1941, moving in single file above a sheer wall of ice. One slip on a ridge like this could pull the whole line with it. A massive anchor from Caligula's Nemi ships was raised after the lake was drained in the late 1920s. The vessels had lain underwater for nearly 1,900 years. A 1936 salon machine promised to shake fat off the legs without exercise. Beauty gadgets like this sold the dream of an effortless fix long before modern fitness culture. John F. Kennedy smoked cigars in private, even while presenting a polished public image. One day before the Cuba embargo in 1962, he reportedly had about 1,200 Cuban cigars secured for himself. Mensur was a German student duel where the goal was not to win, but to stand still and take the cut. The face scar it left, called a schmiss, became a badge of nerve and status. The Maserati 4 CL 1500 Aerodynamica arrives for the Tripoli Grand Prix in 1939. This sleek one-off racer made its only known appearance there. Portlock, Alaska was abandoned by the 1950s, leaving the settlement empty. Officially, the decline followed economic change, but local legend blamed a shadowy being called Nantinak that was said to take people. In 1985, Courtney Cox appeared in a Tampax ad that broke a television taboo by saying the word "period" on air. 8 years later, she became Monica on Friends. A daguerreotype from the wreck of the SS Central America survived nearly 130 years on the Atlantic floor. The ship went down in 1857 carrying California gold, and the loss helped fuel a financial panic. Archaeologists at Inchtuthil found about 875,000 Roman iron nails buried in one hidden cache around 87 AD. The Romans likely buried them before leaving so local tribes could not turn the fortress metal into weapons. A lone soldier stands above a sea of clouds on the Italian front during the First World War. In the Alps, men fought not only each other, but also avalanches, frost, and cliffs that killed just as easily. A fisherman and his family lived on this tiny shanty boat on the Mississippi in Missouri in 1914. Families like this turned the river itself into home, work, and survival. On January 26, 1972, Vesna Vulovic survived a fall from a broken Jet airliner after an explosion tore Flight 367 apart over Czechoslovakia. Her survival became the world record for the highest fall without a parachute. On March 4, 1945, Filipino guerrillas in Manila identified a Japanese soldier who had changed into civilian clothes after the battle. Local fighters were often the only people who could spot who truly belonged and who was trying to disappear. The leather man walked the same route through New York and Connecticut for decades in a handmade leather suit. When his grave was opened in 2011, only coffin nails remained. In 1955, two traders cornered almost all of Chicago's onions, then crashed the market while betting on the fall. The scandal was so huge that onion futures were banned in the United States in 1958. In 1973, Richard Nixon flew on a regular United Airlines flight during the energy crisis instead of using Air Force One. It remains the only time a sitting United States president flew on a scheduled commercial airliner. In 1993, the Nordic Battalion in Bosnia became known for ignoring passive orders when civilians were at risk. Their defiance gave them a hard reputation, but it also made them one of the few United Nations units many locals trusted. Oxford was already teaching students by 1096, yet no one knows its exact founding date. It is the oldest university in the English-speaking world. In 1946, corrupt officials in Athens, Tennessee, locked ballot boxes in the jail after arresting voters and poll watchers. Local war veterans answered with guns, surrounded the jail, and forced the ballots back into public view. After the Soviet collapse, Lithuania was too broke to fund its 1992 Olympic basketball team, so the Grateful Dead paid for the trip. Lithuania then won bronze in Barcelona, wearing the band's wild tie-dye shirts. Heather Mosher married David in a hospital chapel in Connecticut in 2017 while fighting late-stage cancer. She died less than a day later, turning the wedding into their goodbye. The United States Army tested a football-shaped anti-armor grenade so soldiers could throw it more naturally. One early prototype was even built from a hollowed-out Nerf football. The first televised debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon aired in September 1960. Radio listeners often thought Nixon did fine, but television viewers saw Kennedy as the clear winner. A Soviet soldier at Chernobyl in 1986 wears crude lead shielding because ordinary gear offered almost no defense there. Men sent onto the site often worked in tiny bursts because the radiation was too intense. American troops inspect captured German flamethrowers on the Western Front in 1918. These weapons were terrifying in trench warfare, but they also made their operators prime targets the moment they appeared. Marlon Brando often used cue cards during The Godfather in 1972 instead of fully memorizing lines. Robert Duvall sometimes held them just out of frame. Workers re-raised Stonehenge Stone 23 after it fell in 1963. Even one famous ancient monument still needed modern cranes to stay standing. Austrian soldiers held mountain posts like this in the Isonzo fighting, where altitude could be as deadly as enemy fire. Men dragged guns and supplies across bare rock, snow, and cliffs just to keep a single position alive. Natalia Kovshova and Maria Polivanova became the first female snipers to be named Heroes of the Soviet Union on February 14, 1943. Months earlier, near Sutoki, they fought until they ran out of ammunition. These extra FAB-500 bombs were produced above quota at a Siberian factory in 1942 for the front. Soviet industry pushed so hard during the war that even bomb batches could be marked as beyond plan. A child's note on the wall of a ruined house reads like a frozen message from the chaos of the Eastern Front. It says, "Mama, we left for town with Papa in the morning and are waiting for you. Signed, Slava." In East Prussia, after a battle, one soldier shaved another during a rare quiet moment. Even at the front, men held on to small routines that made the war feel human again. A German warning sign still stood in liberated Sevastopol after the occupation ended. It marked a forbidden zone and warned that anyone going farther faced execution. This is one of the atomic shadows left in Japan in 1945, where a person blocked the blast flash for a split second. The heat lightened the surrounding surface, leaving only a dark human outline behind. Stanley Troutman photographed Nagasaki on September 13, 1945, just over a month after the atomic bombing. The man pushing his loaded bicycle through the ruins turns the scale of the destruction into something painfully ordinary. A marker was placed at the Nagasaki impact point one day after the atomic bombing in August 1945. The land around it stayed scarred and largely empty as the city faced one of the hardest rebuilds in modern history. A Russian Air Force Mi-26 burned at Botlik near the Chechen border after a landing error on September 25, 1999. The Mi-26 was the heaviest lift helicopter in the world, built to carry loads that smaller helicopters could not even attempt. On April 28, 1943, P-8 bombers dropped the first serial FAB-5000 bombs on the coastal fortifications of Königsberg. At 5,000 kilograms, it was one of the largest Soviet air bombs used in the war. Police held back screaming teenage fans outside an Elvis Presley concert in 1956 as his rise turned live shows into near chaos. The frenzy was so intense that adults were already calling it a new kind of mass hysteria. Paul McCartney was detained at Tokyo Airport in 1980 after Japanese authorities found cannabis in his luggage. The arrest ended Wing's Japan tour before it even began. A grandmother crashed her car straight into a United States pharmacy in 1993 and then faced a police officer across the counter. Photos like this became instant local news classics because the wreck looked almost too absurd to be real. A young Wehrmacht soldier stands at Kursk in 1943 during the largest tank battle in history. The fight crushed Germany's last major offensive in the east and turned the front for good. This street was left wrecked after the anti-Greek riots in Istanbul on September 6 and 7, 1955. The violence shattered one of the city's oldest Greek communities and sped up its long collapse. A high school cheer squad rehearses in the street in 1958, when cheerleading was still closer to drill and chant than the acrobatic sport it became later. In 1986, David Kirk tried to cross the English Channel from England using helium balloons. The stunt looked almost unreal, with a man hanging in open sky beside sheer white cliffs. Rows of East German T-55 tanks sat in storage at Bautzen in 1991 after the Berlin Wall fell. Within months, machines built for a Warsaw Pact war had become leftovers from a state that no longer existed. British troops used dummy heads like this in the First World War to bait enemy snipers into revealing their position. One shot at the decoy could expose a hidden rifle that had stayed invisible for days. MiG-21 No. 4324 stands on display in Vietnam, above the wreckage of a downed American aircraft. By 1986, scenes like this had turned war trophies into public memory. Hungary faced the Soviet Union in the blood-in-the-water match at the Melbourne Olympics in 1956, one of the most famous Cold War clashes in sport. Hungary won 4-0, and the image of Irvin Zador bleeding made the game unforgettable. The first drive-in theater opened in Pennsauken, New Jersey on June 6, 1933. Drivers paid 25 cents per car, and the first feature shown was Wife Beware. This beach scene was photographed in Iran just months before the 1979 revolution changed the country forever. Images like this became so striking later because they captured a version of everyday public life that soon vanished. Black Monday in 1987 triggered one of the worst stock market crashes ever recorded. Global losses were estimated at about $1.71 trillion. Bosnian soldiers held Friday prayer on the foundation of a destroyed mosque in 1995. In the Bosnian War, even worship often returned first to ruins. Crowds filled Manila during the People Power Revolution in 1986 as mass protests helped bring down Ferdinand Marcos. The uprising became one of the clearest moments when civilians, clergy, and defecting troops stood on the same side. Robert F. Kennedy campaigned so directly that he often spoke from car roofs right in the middle of the crowd. In 1968, scenes like this turned his campaign into one of the most electric in American politics. A Detroit store owner stood behind his door with a shotgun during the 1967 riots. The handwritten sign saying "Soul Brother" was meant to signal that the business was black-owned and should be spared. George Carlin was arrested in Wisconsin on May 27, 1972, after performing his 7 words routine. The case became part of the long fight over free speech and broadcast limits. Malcolm X kept a rifle close in March 1964 after repeated death threats followed his break with the Nation of Islam. He had just accused Elijah Muhammad of secret relationships that shook the movement from within. Sydney Harbor Bridge stands almost joined in 1930, with the 2 steel halves creeping toward each other over the water. When it opened in 1932, it became the widest long-span bridge in the world. Hitler exits St. Mary's Church in Wilhelmshaven in 1931 before he seized full power in Germany. Images like this mattered later because they showed how carefully he used public appearances to look respectable. In 1938, men walked with signs mocking broken promises and failed banks during the Depression era. The joke looked simple, but it carried the anger of people who had already watched trust collapse. Burning oil wells turned Kuwait's sky black during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. Retreating Iraqi forces set hundreds of wells ablaze, creating one of the worst man-made environmental disasters of the war. United States airborne troops and Dominican civilians took cover together in Santo Domingo in 1965. The intervention began as a Cold War move to stop another Cuba in the Caribbean. A British sniper decoy was built to draw a shot in the First World War. One bullet into the fake head could give away a hidden enemy position. Crowds climbed the Berlin Wall in 1989 as the barrier that had split Berlin for 28 years began to fall. Within hours, a Cold War border built to stop escape had turned into a public celebration. At Ristilahti in July 1941, a prisoner in Finnish hands was used to call surrender demands to Soviet troops through a field loudspeaker. The bluff failed, and the Finnish line broke the next day. The tomb of the unknown soldier has been guarded every minute since July 2, 1937. Even hurricanes, snow, and midnight storms have not stopped the watch. New Yorkers look up in shock during the September 11 attacks in 2001. In minutes, ordinary streets turned into silent viewing points for one of the most watched disasters in history. A rock carving in the Caucasus reportedly bears a Nazi symbol, and the date, 1942, the year German forces reached the region. If authentic, it marks the short axis, pushed toward the oil routes of the northern Caucasus. Frank Pomeroy of the 1st Marines sits bloodied and exhausted on Palaliu in September 1944 after 36 hours of non-stop fighting. Before this, he had already fought on Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and New Britain. British transport ship SS Talabat is hit in Malta Harbor on March 23, 1942, during a brutal air raid on a convoy carrying vital supplies. In the siege of Malta, one burning ship could mean food, fuel, and ammunition never reached the island. Air crews at Daniel Field learned aircraft by silhouette in July 1943 because one fast mistake in the sky could cost an entire mission. This class turned split-second recognition into survival. A teenage German soldier stands in British custody after the Battle of Overloon on October 17, 1944, looking more like a lost schoolboy than a battlefield veteran. Overloon became one of the hardest fights in the Netherlands. A Marine uses a flamethrower on Iwo Jima on February 27, 1945, where hidden cave positions slowed every step forward. Fighting on the island was so close and brutal that even the ground could hide danger. John McCain is treated in a Hanoi hospital in November 1967 after his aircraft was brought down over North Vietnam. He would spend more than 5 years in captivity, turning this quiet image into the start of a long and historic ordeal. Auto polo players chase a giant ball in stripped-down cars, turning a horse sport into pure machine chaos in the 1910s. It drew huge crowds, but the crashes wrecked so many cars that the sport burned out almost as fast as it rose. Dwight H. Johnson receives the Medal of Honor from President Lyndon B. Johnson in November 1968 for holding off a fierce attack in Vietnam almost alone. The shock is that this war hero was dead by 1971 after a failed mini-mart robbery. Workers install one of USS Iowa's huge 16-inch guns in October 1942, building the firepower that made battleships floating fortresses. Each shell from these guns could weigh more than a small car. Waves trainees sit through a cold chamber test at Jacksonville Naval Air Station in October 1943, learning what air crews faced at high altitude. Even training could feel like a trial before the real mission. A San Antonio soldier comes home from the Second World War as his sister runs toward him after years apart. He had fought from Okinawa to occupied Korea, but this split second at the station became the real victory. USS Maddox disappears into monster seas during Typhoon Cobra in December 1944, when even warships looked tiny against the storm. The typhoon was so savage it overturned 3 American destroyers and tore through the fleet like an invisible enemy. Wingate's force lands by glider behind Japanese lines in Burma on March 5, 1944, in one of the wildest airborne raids of the war. They put down hundreds of men, mules, and even bulldozers in the jungle to build a hidden base almost overnight. Soviet assault troops in steel body armor walk back with DP-27 machine guns in the summer of 1944, looking more like moving tanks than infantry. Their SN-42 breastplates were made for brutal close combat, where even a small edge could decide who came back. Vienna's giant Ferris wheel stands broken in 1945, turning one of Europe's great attractions into a ghost of the war. It was the tallest wheel on Earth for years, and even wrecked, it still looks unreal. Kim Jong-un sits with his first teacher in 1990 in a rare image from the sealed world that shaped a future ruler. Photos like this are almost never seen, which is why this quiet classroom moment feels so strange now. IJN carrier Amagi lies broken and half-sunk in July 1945, a shattered symbol of a navy that once dominated the Pacific. By this stage of the war, even Japan's biggest warships were becoming wrecks before they could change anything. A giant Mussolini head rises in Ethiopia in 1935, built to turn conquest into a monument. It did not last long, and that makes this photo even stranger now. Michael and Robert Rosenberg read the headlines about their parents in 1951, too young to grasp that the case would become one of the Cold War's most infamous trials. The photo feels almost unreal because history hit this family before the boys were even old enough to choose their own future. Henry Fournier stands inside a Massachusetts mill in 1911, a child worker surrounded by machines built for adults. Lewis Hine took photos like this to expose how normal child labor had become in American factories. A soldier of the 4th Infantry Division digs in above the Prum Valley in 1945 as the road to the Rhine narrows to one cold hillside. The front looked quiet from here, but every field below was part of Germany's last line. Medical teams used trained dogs to find wounded soldiers on battlefields, turning a dog's nose and loyalty into a life-saving tool. In the chaos of war, these animals could reach men faster than human search parties ever could. Tito and Castro meet on the Brioni Islands in March 1976, two Cold War leaders outside the orbit of both superpowers. A quiet photo, but politically it meant a lot. A Tunisian Bedouin woman is photographed in 1907, wearing layers of silver jewelry that signaled identity, status, and family ties. The image feels striking because every detail was meant to be read long before a single word was spoken. A woman cooks dinner on a bathtub in a Lower East Side tenement in the 1940s, where one cramped room had to serve as kitchen, bathroom, and home. This is what overcrowded New York looked like when even a bathtub became part of daily survival. Erich Mielke salutes East German troops in December 1967 as his feared security empire tightened its grip. Even the ceremony honored Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Soviet secret police. Russian troops counterattack at Osowik in 1915 just after a gas strike, creating the legend later called the Attack of the Dead Men. The scene stunned the Germans because men who should have collapsed were still moving forward. Charlene Hunter walks into the University of Georgia on January 20, 1961, as one of its first two black students. A simple walk to class became a turning point in American history. Chechen fighters stand at a roadside in March 1996 during the First Chechen War, when control of whole towns could shift in hours. The photo feels tense because it captures a conflict that looked local on the street but shook all of post-Soviet Russia. The last Shah of Iran stands beside Stalin at Tehran in 1943, while his country sat under Allied occupation. A future ruler, but in this frame, he looks like the smallest man in the room. Ernest Hemingway writes in Sun Valley in 1939 while working on For Whom the Bell Tolls, one of his most famous novels. A quiet mountain table became the birthplace of a story shaped by war, loss, and doomed love. Princess Cecilia and Victoria Louise pose in uniform around 1910, turning royal image into military theater. Just a few years later, Europe's courts would be swallowed by war. American soldiers patrol past an abandoned church near Da Nang in 1968, where war and silence share the same ground. The ruins behind them say almost as much as the men do. Ernest Hemingway writes in Sun Valley in 1939 while working on For Whom the Bell Tolls. One quiet table, one future classic. 4-year-old Riyad al-Sol stands in this 1898 portrait decades before becoming the first prime minister of independent Lebanon. A future nation builder appears here as just a child, which makes the photo hit harder. USS North Carolina arrives at Wilmington in 1961 to become a permanent memorial after surviving the Pacific War. A battleship built for combat ended up as a monument on the river. Judy Garland is seen just weeks before her death in June 1969, still carrying the fragile glamour that made her a legend. The harder truth is that Hollywood had worn her down since childhood. Elvis Presley checks out his custom hound dog Schwinn in 1957 at Paramount, right as his fame was exploding. Even his bicycle had star power. Pennsylvania oil derricks cover the hillside in 1895, turning the landscape into an early industrial forest. This was the age when black crude was already remaking America. While we're looking at these photos, don't forget to write in the comments. Which historical shot did you like the most? And for what reason? The Shakespeare Memorial Theatre burns in Stratford on March 6, 1926, turning one of England's great stages into ruins. Even Shakespeare's hometown could not save its most famous theatre from one afternoon of fire. Queen Victoria sits with 3 generations of her family in 1886, including the future mother of Prince Philip. A royal family photo, but it quietly reaches deep into Europe's next century. Jet Li and Aaliyah share a rare behind-the-scenes moment in 2000, while Romeo Must Die linked film and music into one hit. The photo feels special now because it caught 2 stars from very different worlds in the same frame. A Maori statue of Queen Victoria stands in Ohinemutu in the early 1900s. The bust was gifted in 1870 to Te Arawa for backing the New Zealand government in the colonial wars. Maple Leaf Stadium rises in March 1926 at a cost of $750,000. Horse carts and cranes built the same ballpark together. Rachel Knight was an enslaved woman in Mississippi who secretly fed, treated, and guided Newton Knight's anti-Confederacy fighters during the Civil War. Without her, the Swamp Rebellion in Jones County may not have survived. Alan Cobham is racing from Cape Town to England in March 1926 to break a speed record. He had already covered 5,000 miles in 7 days. A late 19th century musician poses with a guitar and giant horn in one of the strangest studio portraits you will ever see. Even if the exact identity is lost, the image captures an era when performers sold mystery as much as music. Vicki Dugan turned a backless dress into her trademark in the mid-1950s and became one of Hollywood's boldest publicity stunts. Her look was so iconic, it later helped inspire Jessica Rabbit. Russian soldiers ride in stacked hammocks inside a railway car in 1912, showing how armies packed men for mass movement before the First World War. Just 2 years later, the Russian Empire would send millions into a conflict it could not survive. 2 Ainu men from Hokkaido pose in the early 1900s, members of one of Japan's oldest native peoples. By then, forced assimilation was already crushing Ainu language, dress, and daily life. 2 men cook on a chimney stove after the Great Seattle Fire of 1889. The blaze destroyed downtown, but people were already rebuilding and eating in the ashes. The Hunter brothers kept a plane in the air for 23 days in 1930 by taking fuel and food from another aircraft. They even did mechanical work mid-air. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Schwartz ran surgery at Baton's Jungle Hospital under fire and with almost no supplies. He survived the Baton Death March and nearly 4 years of captivity. At Monte Cassino in 1944, an American soldier reportedly bandaged a 17-year-old German boy instead of leaving him to die. The boy later wrote that the enemy he was meant to kill had saved his life. Richard Norris Williams survived the Titanic and refused to let doctors remove his frozen legs. Just months later, he returned to tennis and later became a Wimbledon champion. In 1916, one proposal said any American who voted for war should be signed up to fight in it. It exposed a fear that leaders could start wars while ordinary people paid the price. In 1942, HMS Porcupine was torn so badly by a torpedo that the Royal Navy towed both halves home, still afloat. The broken ship was later used in 2 pieces, with the halves jokingly called HMS Pork and HMS Pine. Sultan Mohammed V of Morocco refused to treat Moroccan Jews as separate people under wartime pressure. Around 250,000 Jews lived in Morocco then, and no mass deportation from Morocco to Nazi camps took place. In 1942, Nobuo Fujita carried out the only wartime air attack on the mainland United States, dropping firebombs over Oregon from a small plane launched by submarine. 20 years later, he returned to the same town in peace and was welcomed as an honorary citizen. Kyoto was once the top target for the atomic bomb, but Henry Stimson kept removing it from the list. His decision spared one of Japan's greatest cultural treasures and changed history forever. Qing Shi rose from the docks of Canton to command one of the largest pirate fleets in history, with more than 300 ships under her control. She became so powerful that she fought empires, then negotiated a pardon and retired rich and free. Qing Shi rose from a floating brothel in Canton to command a pirate confederation that controlled hundreds of ships. She later secured a full pardon, kept her wealth, and became one of the few pirate legends to die free. On Iwo Jima in March 1945, a marine cemetery was being built while the island around it still looked like the surface of the moon. This stark aerial view shows how one of the Pacific War's fiercest battles turned nearly every patch of ground into a crater. When Prohibition ended in Philadelphia in 1933, workers rushed crates of legal alcohol back into public view almost overnight. This photo captures the instant a national ban collapsed and a huge hidden trade stepped into the open. On Iwo Jima, on February 19, 1945, 5th Division Marines pushed inland under Mount Suribachi just after landing. The black volcanic sand slowed every step, turning the first advance into a brutal struggle within minutes. On Iwo Jima, in late February 1945, Marines reached a Japanese pillbox that had been smashed into broken concrete and twisted steel by naval guns and airstrikes. Even after that level of bombardment, many bunkers on the island still kept firing from hidden tunnels and buried strongpoints. In Constanza, in 1941, people stand among fresh ruins left by Soviet air raids as smoke and dust still hang over the street. The blast hit one of Romania's most important Black Sea ports, turning a busy city center into a scene of sudden destruction. In Moscow in August 1991, people lined up for Pepsi while a tank stood beside them during the Soviet collapse. The photo captures one of history's strangest contrasts, everyday life and a superpower breaking apart in the same frame. In Cologne on March 6, 1945, a German Panther burns in the street after being hit by a Pershing from Eagle 7. Just moments earlier, the same Panther had knocked out a Sherman, making this one of the first dramatic tank duels fought by the new American heavy tank. South of Venice around 1930, oil derricks lined the beach so densely that the coast looked more like an industrial field than a resort. This stretch helped power Los Angeles during the oil boom, when wells stood almost at the edge of the Pacific. At Lincoln's second inauguration on March 4, 1865, the crowd packed the muddy Capitol grounds just weeks before the Civil War ended. This rare image captures the tense final chapter of a divided nation as thousands gathered to watch history turn. At Coventry Zoo in the mid-1970s, this towering Zulu figure looked huge enough to terrify plenty of children before they even got closer. In Kolpino after the war, crowds gathered outside this damaged factory kitchen building for the public trial of Boris Afanasiev, a former engineer who later served the occupiers as mayor of Sablino. He was accused of helping send more than 2,000 civilians to forced labor in Germany. In August 1943 on the Bryansk front, this rare photo caught at least 11 Red Army medical dog teams in one frame. These dogs pulled wounded soldiers out of fire zones. Soviet soldiers pause in the snow for a brief rest, grabbing heat, food, and a moment of silence between battles. Photos like this show a harder truth of war. Even a few quiet minutes could feel like a gift. During the blizzard of 1996, people walked down roads that cars could barely use as snow and wind erased the world around them. The storm buried parts of the East Coast under massive snowfall and shut down entire cities for days. In April 1895, floodwater swallowed Moscow streets so deeply that homes stood like islands beneath the walls of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. The two-day flood became one of the city's most striking disasters. A nun on a New York beach in 1968 looks almost unreal as she calmly photographs people in swimsuits around her. That one frame captures a culture changing fast, with old rules and the new world standing side by side. In Moscow in 1918, Bolsheviks pulled down the monument to Alexander III as the old empire was being erased in public view. The new regime did not just take power, it remade the streets, symbols, and memory of Russia almost overnight. In July 1916, Russian troops heading to the southern front pause on a crowded rail convoy beside wagons, gear, and a samovar. The scene feels calm, but it was taken during the Brusilov offensive, one of the deadliest. In 1985, the Soviet anti-alcohol campaign turned even a giant vodka bottle into a public warning. The crackdown was so severe that vineyards were destroyed, sales were slashed, and one of the country's oldest habits was pushed into hiding. On the USS New Mexico in 1944, a tiny black cat named Saipan became the ship's new mascot after the battle for the island. In the middle of a brutal Pacific War, even a rescued kitten could become part of the crew. In 1912, Franz Reichelt wore his own parachute suit to the top of the Eiffel Tower and jumped himself instead of using a dummy. He was warned not to do it, but his fatal leap became one of history's most haunting early aviation experiments. On July 28, 1945, a B-25 bomber vanished into thick fog and struck the Empire State Building high above Manhattan. 14 people were killed, yet the tower stayed structurally sound. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, protesters faced rows of National Guard troops just outside Grant Park. The image captures the moment America's political crisis spilled into the street, with war, anger, and authority standing face to face. In July 1999, Iranian students filled the streets after a university dormitory raid turned protest into a national crisis. What began with demands for press freedom quickly became one of the boldest youth uprisings since the revolution. In London in 1944, Wally's barber shop answered bomb damage with jokes on the window and a promise to stay open. The humor feels almost unreal, but that kind of defiance became part of how the city endured the Blitz and its aftermath. John Kennedy Jr. looks almost too relaxed for a school yearbook photo, slouched in his seat in New York in 1975. Even as a teenager, he already carried the strange mix of fame, style, and public attention that followed the Kennedy name. Abdul Wali was an Afghan farmer who gave himself up in 2003, hoping to clear his name after being wrongly accused. Instead, he died in custody, and his case became one of the darkest symbols of abuse in the early war years. At Ascot in Berkshire in 1920, fashion was part of the spectacle, with towering hats and formal dress turning the racecourse into a moving stage. This photo captures the old British ritual where style, class, and public display mattered almost as much as the horses. In 1986, Rudolf Hess sat alone in Spandau prison as the last surviving member of Hitler's inner circle. Once one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, he ended his life as a solitary prisoner guarded by 4 nations. In 1986, South Korean stars Choi Yoon-hee and Shin Sang-ok faced the press after revealing they had been held in North Korea for years. Their story sounded almost impossible, a famous actress and director taken across borders. In the early 1900s, this young woman trained with a homemade punching bag in a brick courtyard, turning an ordinary backyard into a tiny gym. Photos like this are rare because they catch a quieter revolution. Marilyn Monroe is seen here just days before her death in 1962, smiling in a moment that now feels quietly haunting. That is what makes this photo so striking. It captures one of the world's most famous women on the edge of her final chapter. At Kent State on May 4, 1970, students rushed to help after National Guard gunfire turned a campus protest into national shock. 4 students were killed, and the photo became one of the clearest images of America breaking apart at home. In 1975, panic erupted around President Gerald Ford during one of 2 assassination attempts made against him that month. Both attackers were women, and Ford survived both incidents within just 17 days. On August 18, 1920, this ballot box marked the moment American women finally won the right to vote nationwide. But many black women, Native women, and Asian women still faced barriers that kept that right from being fully real for years. At Tehran University in 1975, young women sat together in a moment that now feels like a window into pre-revolution Iran. By the late 1970s, women made up a large share of university students in Iran. In Birmingham on May 4, 1963, a black protester is attacked by a police dog during demonstrations against segregation. The Birmingham campaign helped push civil rights into national focus and built pressure for the Civil Rights Act the next year. In February 1936, the obelisk of Buenos Aires rose in the middle of a demolition zone as workers cleared space for the widening of 9 de Julio Avenue. The monument was built in just a few weeks and went on to become the city's most famous landmark. At the start of 1933, Albert Einstein hid in Norfolk after fleeing Nazi Germany. Armed guards protected him there for about 3 weeks before he left Europe for good. In Stakliškės, Lithuania, in 1933, Jewish residents dressed up for Purim and posed together in the snow. Just a few years later, much of Lithuania's Jewish world would be destroyed during the Holocaust. In Paris, Texas, this tank rolled past the Grand Theater after the cinema opened in September 1937. Small-town streets like this could still turn into military parade routes when war mobilization reached everyday America. In Paris, Texas, a tank sits outside the Grand Theater beneath a marquee for Edward G. Robinson's destroyer. The theater had opened in September 1937, so within just a few years, its downtown entrance was sharing the street with military armor. In 1940, Simo Häyhä posed in white camouflage during the Winter War, where Soviet troops gave him the name White Death. He fought mostly with iron sights instead of a scope, because in deep snow and extreme cold, a scope could give away a sniper's position. A Luftwaffe officer takes aim on the firing range as other men train behind him. Marksmanship was a basic skill across the German armed forces, and even Air Force personnel were expected to handle rifles when needed. During the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, a blindfolded American captive is escorted in Tehran after militants seized the United States Embassy. 52 Americans were held for 444 days, making it one of the longest hostage crises in modern history. The Kennedy family stands together here in a rare group moment before later tragedy would turn several of their lives into American history. Few families of the 20th century were photographed so often, yet became so closely tied to power, loss, and myth. Sean Flynn, son of Errol Flynn, later became a war photojournalist and disappeared in Cambodia in 1970 while covering the conflict. He and fellow journalist Dana Stone vanished on Highway 1, and their fate was never confirmed. Soldiers stand beside a drop zone named for Dickie Chappelle, the first American female war correspondent killed while covering combat. She died in Vietnam in 1965 after years of reporting from front lines where few women were allowed to go. In the winter of 1944 at Echt, Germany, medics load a wounded American soldier into a half-track converted into an ambulance. Armored ambulances like this could reach men through mud and shell fire, where ordinary vehicles often could not. In 1941, Finnish troops entered Petrozavodsk during the continuation war against the Soviet Union. Finland renamed the city Ääneslina during its occupation, which lasted until 1944. In 1944, bombs fall over Belgrade during an Allied air raid recorded in wartime Yugoslavia. The city was hit repeatedly that year, and many of the targets were inside heavily populated urban areas. In Barletta on September 12, 1943, German paratroopers detained Italian police officers and firefighters after Italy's surrender and the fighting that followed. The Barletta massacre came just days after local Italian forces had resisted German troops. At Longueval in France during the First World War, an Australian driver lets his horse drink first at a Comforts Fund stall while soldiers wait with their own cups. Horses carried guns, wagons, supplies, and wounded men, so keeping them alive was as vital as feeding the troops. During the First World War, the carrier pigeon Cher Ami delivered a message that helped save 194 trapped American soldiers. Even after being badly wounded, the bird still reached headquarters and became one of the most famous animal heroes of the war. This is Loretta Lynn's parents, Ted and Clara Webb, photographed in Butcher Hollow, Kentucky, where she was born in 1932. Ted worked as a coal miner and farmer, and that hard Appalachian life later shaped many of Loretta Lynn's most famous songs. This image plays on an eerie truth of television. Many classic laugh tracks were built from audience recordings first collected in the 1950s. That means some of the laughter still heard in sitcoms today may come from people who are no longer alive. In January 1944, a Soviet soldier knocks down a German road sign during the offensive that finally broke the siege of Leningrad. The blockade had lasted more than 2 years and caused one of the deadliest urban disasters of the Second World War. In a London underground shelter, Lord Mayor Sir George Wilkinson and Food Minister Lord Woolton drink tea during the air raids. Tea was sold there for 1 penny a cup, turning even a bomb shelter into part of Britain's wartime routine. After the bombing of Rotterdam in 1940, huge sections of the city were reduced to empty blocks and broken streets, with only the burned shell of St. Lawrence Church still rising above the ruins. The attack destroyed the heart of the city. Japanese sailors were arranged here in the shape of the imperial chrysanthemum, the 16-petal symbol of the Japanese emperor. Formations like this turned hundreds of bodies into living propaganda, mixing military discipline with imperial symbolism. Around 1910, circus strongwoman Katie Sanduina, known as Lady Hercules, holds 3 men off the ground in a studio pose. She was one of the most famous strongwomen in the world and was said to lift more than many male performers of her era. In 1916, the Red Baron bends down to his dog in a rare, quiet moment away from the air war. Manfred von Richthofen later became the most famous flying ace of the First World War, with 80 confirmed victories. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.